Welcome back to another episode of The Process, where we spend just a little bit of time looking at stats now, so we can be just a little bit smarter watching games later. CJ Fulton is a 6'2" point guard who plays for Lafayette by way of Ireland. Let's talk about the lad, since there's at least something worth talking about in my opinion. It really starts with his ungodly assist to turnover ratio of 3.4. His playmaking ability is further signaled when we look at the fact that his assist percentage is close to 20, which is significantly higher than his usage at 14%. Granted, he looks like the epitome of a pure point guard, with usage being so low, so he will need to show that he can create more for himself. The shooting sample we have is pretty decent. His steal percentage being almost 3 and defensive rebounding percentage of 15 are also encouraging. No dunks and only 3 blocks. We're clearly not talking about an athletic wonderkind here. And I was curious enough already to go look at a few highlights, and yeah, he doesn't look like a great athlete, which is no shocker. But almost everything else here is pretty interesting. Should be noted he is junior aged, although with a June birthday, he'd be a very young junior. Also, the mere fact that he's playing for Lafayette is kind of a big red flag. So at the end of the day, I don't know that we can take Fulton that seriously. Like I've said for a lot of other guys in his position, it would have been cool to see him transfer to a bigger stage, but it is what it is. If he breaks out statistically this season, I might watch him a bit. He could be a candidate to transfer to a high major next season, if nothing else. Wade Taylor is a 6-foot combo guard playing for Texas A&M, who right now mostly appears to be a volume scorer, with usage slightly above 30%. But given his June 2003 birthday, he's one of the youngest sophomores we've yet seen. While he didn't have any dunks last season and only had 2 blocks, he did have a steal percent close to 4, which is very good, and his defensive rebounding percentage just barely passed the 10% threshold. Now, it should be noted, although he does appear to be able to get shots up, he wasn't the most efficient scorer, and especially worrisome would be his layup percentage being just over 40%. He'll have to improve on these numbers fairly significantly given his archetype. His passing stats were pretty decent, but it would be nice to see his assist-to-turnover ratio tick up a bit. Ideally, from a prospect perspective, you'd like to see him as a starting point guard this season. I kind of assume that would be the case, but I don't know who all Texas A&M has coming in that could compete for that job. 6-foot combo guard, especially one that is not an elite shooter, is a near impossible archetype to have success in the modern NBA. So to the extent he can prove he's more than that, my interest level will rise accordingly. KJ Simpson is a 6'2" guard who plays for Colorado. I watched him at least a couple times last season, and he seems like a decent enough athlete. Similar to what I said for Wade Taylor and so many other smallish guards, Simpson really needs to show he can shoot at a high level. He checks a lot of other boxes, with steal percentage clearing 2, defensive rebounding percentage clearing 10, and he even had a few dunks and blocks. His assist rates are in the top decile, but it would be good if he can improve on the turnovers and the assist-to-turnover ratio. Like Taylor, I don't know if Simpson comes in as the starting point guard this season, but if he does, and if his shooting significantly improves, I could see some second-round potential here, if not higher. Ooh-wee, Matthew Cleveland. You knew he was bound to come up sooner or later in this series. Highly touted coming out of high school, Cleveland decided to return, presumably to improve his stock and skill set. You can see why scouts would love Cleveland in an empty gym. Prototypical wing size and athleticism. 28 dunks in not even a full-time starting role. He could easily surpass 40 this year if he plays 1,000 minutes. Who knows, maybe he'll get 50 dunks. Also had a lot of blocks and good rebounding numbers. His steal percentage seems low, but in this case where the tools are so obvious, that figure is probably very contextual to the system. The playmaking stats are average, which considering his archetype is probably good enough for now, maybe even slightly underrated. At the end of the day, it's pretty clear there's one giant elephant in the room when talking about Cleveland's NBA ceiling. Will he ever shoot at an even passable level? He's basically a non-shooter right now, shooting 55% from the free throw line last season on a not tiny sample of attempts, and he was just 6 of 34 from the three-point line. The lack of attempts is arguably as concerning as the percentage here. In some sense, there's no more obvious NBA prospect in this whole series than Matthew Cleveland, who walks into a gym looking like an NBA athlete. And honestly, he may get drafted on his quote-unquote potential alone, even if the shooting barely ticks up. But we're talking about a lottery pick if he figures out how to shoot. Zach Hicks is a 6'7" wing that plays for Temple. Honestly, as I came across his profile for this video, I was a bit surprised he didn't really come up on my radar last season. His profile reads a bit like a Frankie Fiddler, which hey, +1 for the rare cross-racial comp. Skinny Spencer Jones also comes to mind. Hicks is currently constructed looks like a fairly one-dimensional shooter, but when you have his wing size, that's almost enough in itself. The lack of dunks combined with his steal percentage below 2 is kind of scary given his size and frame, although he did manage a fairly high block rate and defensive rebounding percentage was basically like a big. I should also note his free throw rate was extremely low, and out of his 58 three-point makes, none were unassisted. Hicks profiles as a poor man's Klay Thompson right now, so he has some work to do for sure. But the bones of an NBA prospect, even if an unexciting one, are here, I think. Mohamed Gueye, Mo for short, is a 6'11 center who plays for Washington State, not to be confused with the other Mo Gueye who plays for Pitt. This Mo Gueye actually flirted with both the draft and the transfer portal, but in the end decided to return to Washington State. Given his size, it's pretty obvious looking at his profile that he's an NBA prospect. There's no point going too deep here because he clearly checks the dunks, stocks, rebounding thresholds I tend to look for in a big man. To me, the obvious concerns here are the lack of much playmaking and the poor free throw shooting, which was below 50% in a small sample, but large enough to be a bit worried. I don't know that he'll suddenly become a playmaking 5, but I'd like to have more confidence that he can get up to at least 60% from the foul line. I didn't really watch him at all last season, so he's definitely on my watch list going into this season. Specifically, I'd like to see how he moves. If he's fairly mobile, I could see Gabe being a second round pick, if not higher. Big men like this, if they're not complete stiffs, are forever in demand in the NBA. Jair Davis is a 6'7 beefy wing that profiles more like a big, but I wanted to sneak him in here because he's potentially interesting if he can ever figure out the shooting. Otherwise, he probably has no chance at an NBA job. The combination of dunks, blocks, and rebounding at 6'7 are pretty neat. Very puzzling is the steal percentage below 1. Is that a huge red flag or something about the system he's in? I don't know, but I might be interested enough to watch at least one game. As always, I have to point out when a player is older than his class would indicate, and so it has to be said here that Davis is solidly junior aged. At the end of the day, I think it's unlikely Davis ends up being an NBA player, but like I said, he's at least kind of interesting from a stats perspective. Walter Clayton Jr. is a 6'2 combo guard who plays for Iona. I actually watched at least one Iona game last season, maybe a couple if I remember correctly because of Nelly Jr. Joseph. I distinctly remember thinking Nelly Jr. Joseph isn't really that interesting, but this Walter Clayton kid might be something. He seems pretty athletic and apparently was a football prospect as well. He doesn't really have any red flags statistically and checks basically every box I'm looking for, although it can also be said he doesn't seem to be elite in any one statistical area either. I assume he'll be starting this season and we'll look to see if he breaks out. If he does, I'll definitely be ready for it. I don't have a birthday on him, so if he's junior aged, I'll be less enthusiastic and the bar for his breakout will be higher for me. Myron Amy Jr. is a 6'5 scoring guard who plays for San Jose State. Didn't play a lot of minutes as a freshman, but you can see he ended up top 20 among all returning sophomores in my per possession ranking due to his high usage and having a decent all-around stats profile. If he can repeat this performance in a full season and with a larger role, and especially if he can improve his playmaking numbers, he could be worth a hard look at on tape. At 6'5", 180, he's slight, so you'd like to see him put on another 10 pounds eventually. As with the other prospects, I don't have birthdays for. He becomes more or less interesting depending exactly how old he is. But overall, Amy might be an under the radar returner that could break out. TFL Leonard. I'll be honest, I have no idea how to pronounce that name. I went looking for video and couldn't find anybody actually pronouncing his name. Let's go with TFL Leonard. I'll just call him Leonard. Is a slight 6'7 wing with one of the wildest stats profiles we've seen yet. First of all, in just under 700 minutes, mostly coming off the bench, the dude had 40 dunks, and 13 of those were unassisted. That's elite territory at his size, especially considering how slight his frame is at 175. But perhaps even more impressive than that was the fact that he amassed 56 blocks, an incredible block percentage, close to double digits, which puts him in the 99th percentile. At 6'7", 175, I don't think I've ever seen something like that. Actually, it reminds me of Matisse Thybulle, who as a senior had a block percentage above 8, which is crazy at his height. Of course, the zone defense at Washington had something to do with it, but we've all seen now that Thybulle is a legit defensive force at the next level. I need to watch Leonard to see what the context is at Middle Tennessee. Maybe it's zone 2, I don't know. Needless to say, though, an incredibly explosive wing who conceivably defends at such a high level, all he really needs to do is shoot halfway decent to be interesting at all. Judging from his shooting stats, Leonard certainly has a chance to be a halfway decent shooter. In fact, the main concern I have right now about his profile is his fairly poor playmaking. Would like to see those assist rates improve quite a bit. Also, it should be noted Leonard is a bit older than most sophomores, having a July 2002 birthday, but we've seen a lot of guys with summer birthdays who get held back here. His age isn't too much of a concern here. I'm honestly kind of excited to see where Leonard goes from here. Koby Brea, who plays for Dayton, is another wing in the Fiddler Hicks mold, where he's got good size and legit shooting potential judging by his shooting sample from his freshman year, but there's not a whole lot else right now. No dunks and his steal percentage barely above 1 are flags, but at least he rebounds well on the defensive end. Doesn't turn the ball over much, but there's not too much playmaking yet. And yet, as I've said before, when you have a guy with decent size, and Brea certainly does, who can really shoot it, there's always going to be some interest there. With Deron Holmes, Malachi Smith, and Brea, Dayton should be a really fun team to watch next year. Jalen Warley is a 6'6 guard, or really a point guard, playing for Florida State. You don't see too many guys his size with playmaking stats in the 90th percentile, especially at this level of competition, so Warley is very obviously a guy to watch. Also throw in a near elite steal percentage. The shooting and low usage are question marks. If this is starting to remind you of UCLA Lonzo Ball, you're not alone. Now, one big difference that's obvious is Warley only had 2 dunks last season. Lonzo had 37 freaking dunks his freshman year at UCLA. So let's not get too hyped up here, but Warley certainly has a profile that screams first-round potential if he really shoots it as a sophomore. Julian Reese is a 6'9 big that plays for Maryland. He's also very young for his class, with a mid-summer 2003 birthday. Not really elite in any area as far as bigs go, and he'll need to improve the rebounding for sure. I'd also like to see more playmaking. Perhaps the most intriguing part of his profile right now is that he shot 80% on 51 free throw attempts, which isn't a large sample, but it's large enough to be somewhat optimistic. Right now, I'd probably have Reese a tier below Trevon Brazile, who we covered in a previous episode, but I do think Reese might be slept on a bit going into this draft cycle. If he breaks out, don't say nobody could have seen it coming. Emoni Bates! Who is this guy? Well, everyone watching this video knows his story by now. Bates was an incredibly touted player since he was, I don't know, in middle school probably. Quote unquote next KD. Well, the reality that he's probably not the next KD or even the next Brandon Ingram started to sink in when his pro day measurements were released and turned out to be very disappointing in almost every conceivable way. He only ended up playing 18 games as a freshman for Memphis, and since he was actually too young to be eligible for the draft last year, he returned to school but is transferring to Eastern Michigan, which is basically his hometown school. Now, the first thing we should talk about is that Bates is the first player in this entire series that is actually freshman aged. He's going to be younger than roughly half the freshman class as a sophomore, which is pretty wild. It also might explain a bit why he struggled last year, because he is so young. When we look at the stats, there's nothing really great here, but at the same time, it's maybe not quite as bad as you would think, given all the discussion about how bad his season went. When you factor in that he was really a high school senior, playing in a high major, and still managed to be kind of decent in most areas, if we're being objective here, Bates is still most likely a legitimate draft prospect when it's all said and done. Will he be a top 5 pick? Probably not. But could he be a first round pick? I think that's definitely on the table if he comes in with a fairly typical improvement that you'd expect for an 18-year-old. At his size, even with the negative wingspan, it's still a bonus to have a guy who could potentially shoot and make plays for himself and others. I think a lot of the focus on the eye test for me will be how large are the concerns about his athletic tools, and is he really capable of being a plus defender. The last player we have up today is Alex Fudge, who bolted from LSU like everyone else and is headed for Florida this upcoming season. Fudge is a very young sophomore who has great size at 6'8 and impressive stocks and rebounding numbers. With 17 dunks in under 400 minutes last season, he's obviously an explosive athlete as well. Now he's built more like a wing at 185, but does he have the skill to be a wing, or is he really an undersized big? The shooting numbers, or lack thereof, are obviously of utmost concern here. He'll need to prove he can shoot, or at least improve enough to show he's worth the investment as a project. The other major flag here are the playmaking stats, which were just abysmal. Right now, his skill set definitely makes him look more like a very undersized big rather than a big wing, even if he can defend on the perimeter. Like I said before, he's a young sophomore, so he still has time on his side. Hopefully he's able to get the most out of it. It feels like I saved the best for my last episode on the sophomore class. While none of the 14 guys we looked at are definitely projectable first-round picks, I think there's potential for at least a few to break out and get in that discussion. Matthew Cleveland in some sense has the easiest path if he can figure out the shooting, but that's easier said than done. Emoni Bates is still a high-profile name, and if he can just be halfway decent in Eastern Michigan, I imagine he's in the conversation. Gueye also seems fairly projectable as a draft prospect this year. It's more a question if it's second round or can he be more than that. As for all the other guys, I think right now Leonard, Warley, Reese, and Fudge are probably that next tier of guys that are on the cusp of being draft worthy, but not surefire picks at all. And among the other guys like Taylor, Clayton, Amy, Brea, and Hicks, maybe one or two will break out and become really interesting this year. So that's it for the sophomore class. If you think I missed someone really intriguing, let me know in the comments. Okay, folks, that's it for this episode. Please hit the like and subscribe buttons to help my channel grow. Leave comments or questions below if you have them, and I'll see you next time.